If you're visiting, you've come to us in the middle of our giving campaign. So welcome. It's a great Sunday for you to be here, actually, because we're talking about kind of what makes us tick. And we're trying to get rid of a lot of debt that we have on the church, and we're going to be doing that on June 17th, which is the big Giving Sunday. I'll talk about that a bit more at the end. But week by week, we're kind of talking about what does it mean to be part of this giving campaign. And we opened up with that for us to be debt-free as a church would mean that we would be free to dream. And we have a little wall up there where we asked you guys to fill out some stuff that maybe you kind of felt that, gee, what do I think, what would I like our world to look like? What would I like our church to look like? What are some great ministries that we could see? And who's had a read of that out there? A few people. Have a read if you haven't had a chance to. It's really interesting. You'll be able to pick up some kind of threads all the way through of obviously God speaking to a few people about some stuff, which is really exciting. Last week we talked about free to support. We talked about our mission program that we're looking at, all these things that we do around the church. We talked about how you guys sitting out there have a reach of 63.2 million people, which is kind of crazy, and it's really cool. And this year we're actually looking at sending our first team to India. If you're interested in being a part of that, come and see Sean. If you stick your hand up, Sean, and he'll talk to you a bit more about that. But we're looking at that in the October school holidays. But we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we're talking about. Today we're talking about our heritage. We're talking about our background, where we're from, what is kind of Kalgoorlie Baptist Church all about. And my thanks need to go to Leanne and Kat, who's away, and Bree for all the great decor stuff they've done. They've put a lot of effort out there, as you can see, and have a read of the history of Kalgoorlie Baptist Church, and they've put a lot of effort in here as well. So my thanks to them. They've done a great job. Don't you reckon? It's been good? Yeah. So, heritage. I'll explain a few of the things to you. I'll explain this one first. The PowerPoint background, that and that of the same building, that is the Baptist Church in Kalgoorlie, way back when. So we did a little silhouette, and that's an actual photo of what it used to be. Aren't you glad we're not meeting in that? Imagine, late January, early February in there with the heating. Of course, the plumbing back then was a bit more, a bit different as well. The big rain tank is off to the side. And we're talking a bit about some stories in our church history today. Has anyone out there done any kind of work into their background? Maybe family tree stuff, lineage stuff? Anyone? Anyone found anything interesting? Yeah, Helen?
My family started a Swan Brewery.
Oh, Swan Brewery. That explains it all. That is exciting, the Swan Brewery. Why, Jen? That's great. See if you can get back to that, reclaim that. That's a great company to have. Leanne? Oh, the first ferry service to Rottnest. That's exciting. Anyone else? Anything interesting? Nalene?
Related to Ned Kelly.
Oh, that's fantastic. Related to Ned Kelly. That's great. So heritage is an important thing. I mean, I haven't had a look through it. I don't know if you've seen the Ancestry.com ads that are on TV quite often. And it's kind of become a big thing recently, hasn't it? Finding out what's in your background, finding out what's in your history. And there's all these kind of great stories of, I just jumped on and had a look. And today's sermon is actually sponsored by Ancestry.com. That's right. It's part of our giving campaign stuff now. There's all these people basically sharing about why it's been so interesting to them, why it's been so exciting. They found out, people have owned hotels and, where their lineage came from, all this kind of stuff. Heritage is quite important. And if, I'd like to find out, a bit more about my heritage. I'd love to find out, which Indian guy way back when, decided that they'd follow Jesus, that ensured that my family got to have access to a Christian upbringing. That would be kind of interesting for me. And I can trace it back a couple of generations, but after that it gets a bit murky, partly because I've just been lazy. But it's really interesting. What is our heritage? What is the heritage all about? And today we're talking a bit about that. Knowing where you're from can make a difference to what you do now about getting where you want to go. Right? Knowing where you're from can help. Heritage is important. We're going to, in your small groups, you've been working through Nehemiah primarily, a bunch of other books of the Bible. And if you've got your Bibles, turn to Nehemiah chapter 9. If you haven't, that's okay. I'll be jumping through it, so I'll read it out to you. But Nehemiah is this great guy who worked as the kind of the cupbearer, or in layman's terms, the poison tester for the king. And he heard all about his homeland in Israel and how things are going in Jerusalem. And his heart broke at that. And he was exiled away, and he prayed about this, and his boss, the king, Artaxerxes, looked at him and said, wow, you look a bit downcast, what's going on? He explained the story that, look, this is what my homeland is in, and he did a real quick one-sentence prayer, God help me, and said, would you be able to let me go and fix it up? And the king said, oh yeah, you can do that, and here's all the stuff you need to fix it up, etc. And Nehemiah goes back to this people who are broken and desolate, who kind of, not many of them lived in Jerusalem. In fact, you'll hear at the end of Nehemiah, each group of people had to pick 1 out of 10, like in their family, to go and live in Jerusalem. They volunteered because it wasn't a great place to live because it was pretty run down. But now they'd built it up. And he went and they rebuilt the city, and they rebuilt the walls in 52 days. And often Nehemiah, we think, as kids, we can think that's the story, This guy went in there, they rallied together, they built, this place. We hear really cool names like Sanballat, and those are the kind of names that we hear about, people that were really against them, and it's a story of kind of coming together and triumphing, despite people attacking you. But in the midst of all of this story, we find Nehemiah chapter 9. Ezra kind of opens it up a lot more, but with the book of Ezra, but Nehemiah is, he chucks us in there. And he says that what happened is that all the people came together. It says in Nehemiah 8, and Ezra, one of the prophets of those days, stood up and read out the law of God. So he basically called people back to their heritage. He said, this is what we're based on. This is what we're about. And he talks about how the people were so enthralled. Nehemiah said, look guys, this is actually pretty awesome. So why doesn't everyone run back home, grab whatever you need, and come back, and let's just set up camp here. They actually did that. So they all kind of, it's like preaching a good sermon. One day this might happen to me. And in the middle of the sermon, someone gets up and goes, this is so great. Everyone run home, get some supplies, get some leaves and stuff, and let's just make little houses around here so we can just kind of hang out here and listen to this. So they did that, and they all came back, and they set up in the area, and Ezra continued to talk. Nehemiah 9 opens up with this. On the 24th day of the same month. So they started, when the 7th month came, right? They started at the beginning. On the first day of the 7th month. So this is 24 days of this. The Israelites gathered together, fasting and wearing sackcloth and having dust on their heads. Which sounds weird to us. We wouldn't really, someone walked in like that, we'd go, bold fashion statement, but it's probably not working for you. But what it meant back then was a real sign of reverence. Right? It was kind of like, this is as low as I'm going to get. I'm not going to pretend I know all the answers. I'm not going to pretend I've got it all together. I'm not going to pretend like I'm all powerful, like I'm sussing it out. By wearing this, we're actually saying, I'm admitting that I'm pretty stuffed up, I have no real clue, and I'm here to listen. That's what it was. I'm mourning. I'm kind of aware that I'm not all together, and I submit to this. That's a really important thing for us to kind of keep in mind today. A lot of times we can walk forward with this all-knowing attitude. But here these Israelites came forward after hearing the law and went, man, we do not have it all together. So they all pitched up wearing the stuff, sitting there, hearts straight away saying, all right, say what you got to say, God, I'm listening. Verse 2, those of Israelite descent had separated themselves from foreigners. So that sounds really racist, but it's not. In reading the story, they talked about how Israel in its past history had stuffed up in the way that as they had married people from other countries, as they had kind of connected, they began to take on the beliefs of those people, their gods, their traditions that went clearly against God's plans for them. So what they did is they said, look, we need to separate ourselves from that. So they kind of said, look, we know that these people are part of our group, but they don't believe these things. They come from this background, and that is what they hold. So we're actually going to say, no, this is all about God. Basically, this is about Yahweh, which is their name for God. So we're here. Okay? They stood in their places and confessed their sins and the wickedness of their fathers. They stood there, not just their dads. This means their ancestors. They stood where they were and read from the book of the law of the Lord, their God, for a quarter of the day. This is spent reading it. And spent another quarter in confession and in worshiping the Lord their God. It opens up in the middle of verse 5. It says, blessed be your glorious name, and may it be exalted above all. This is to God. Above all blessing and praise. You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry host, the stars. the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. You are the Lord God who chose Abram. Now, this is Abraham's name before he became Abraham. So they start way back when as Abraham, who is regarded as the beginning of their people group. All right? Father Abraham, right? No? Okay, anyway. Many nightmares to that song. Good times also, but nightmares generally. When will it end? And they talk about him. They said, verse 8, you, God, found his heart faithful to you, and you made a covenant with him to give his descendants the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites. You kept your promise because you are righteous. Then you saw the suffering of our forefathers in Egypt. Fast forward to verse 16. But they, our forefathers, became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey your commands. That's not about bad posture or sleeping practices. That's like they wouldn't turn around. They wouldn't obey you. They're upright. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to slavery. This is them appointing King Saul. But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. Therefore, you do not desert them, even when they cast from themselves an image of a calf. This is Aaron, and said, this is your God who brought you up out of Egypt, or when they committed awful blasphemies. Verse 20, you gave your good spirit to instruct them. You do not withhold manna. This is Moses and the guys in the desert from their mouths. You gave them water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the desert. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen. Goes all the way down to verse 28. But as soon as they were at rest, he talks about God rescuing them in between this. From heaven, I'll start in verse 27. From heaven you heard them, and in your great compassion you gave them deliverers. You rescued them from the hands of the enemies. Verse 28. But as soon as they were at rest, they again did what was evil in your sight. Then you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so that they ruled over them. And when they cried out to you again, you heard them from heaven, and in your compassion you delivered them time after time. Verse 31, but in your great mercy you did not put an end to them or abandon them, for you are a gracious and merciful God. The Israelites got together and had a heritage lesson. And they talked about, where are we from? And this might be something interesting for you to go back, and for those of us from Christian homes to go and figure out where Christ stepped into our family. You know, this is what they did. Where did God step into our story? And they began to thank God for what he had done. But they also acknowledged when they'd stuffed up. Part of our giving campaign is that we wanted to devote a week simply to this concept of free to keep building. We wanted to share with you a bit of Kalgoorlie Baptist Church's heritage. One of the things that's important is that it wasn't just KBC, it was BBC, as in the TV network and the radio network, now Boulder Baptist Church. And they had a lot of interesting stories. There's a book out there that Rob Douglas, who's a pastor in Perth, has put together wonderfully. And you can welcome to come and grab a copy of that from us. And in there, it's got all these stories about the church and where it started. It started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with a bunch of people who got together and said, let's hang out in Kalgoorlie and make a church. Let's get together and become the Baptist church. In Cal, you'll find this out tonight at Church Together, because heritage also happens to be the theme of tonight's Church Together. There was a lot of churches, simply because no one had cars back then, funny enough. So the church needed to be in walking distance. So there's quite a few different types of churches. And they were all of different variations. Some of the cool stories in KBC's background is that it started with a group of people who took a risk and said, let's get together and start a church. And they worked hard, and they got people together. They tried to find a pastor. They got a pastor after a while, and quite a few preachers have been part of our history. And they set up the first church. Not in a great location. In fact, it was in such a dodgy location that if you're a woman or a kid, you needed to be escorted to church on a Sunday. You need to have security. You needed to have bouncers with you in Kalgoorlie to come to church, because it wasn't in the greatest neighborhoods. So there'd be basically, people had to get escorted right up to the front door of the church with bouncers, because it was, right next to the brothels, the houses of ill repute, as they called them, and all these places. To give you a bit of an idea, here's a wonderful poem I'll read out to you. It says, I don't mind blokes, this is by a Kalgoorlie author, of course. I don't mind blokes who digs and stokes, who fiddle or work on derricks. I can even stand a German band, but I draw the line at clerics. Why strike me pink? I'd sooner drink with a cove sent up for arson than a rain beseeching, preaching, teaching, blanky, cranky parson. I snort and gibe at the whole of the tribe, whatever their sect or class is. From lawn-sleeved ranters or curbstone canters, from bishops to army lasses. Give me blaspheming, scheming, screaming, barracking football garsons, in preference to the reverend gents, the blithering, blathering parsons. Not really loving pastors very much, written by W.R. Burton, Kalgoorlie's mayor. He wrote that because they wanted to get Sunday sport up and running, and the guys are saying, look, now you've got to be at church. You're working all these days. Church is important, Sabbath, all that kind of stuff. And the churches came against him and said, look, there's going to be a vote, and we're going to vote against this. And he hated that. So much so that one day, when the church was meeting, and our good, honourable Reverend Kennedy, who was one of our pastors way back when, went up, and they were on their way to church. And they stood there, and as they were walking in, they saw a bunch of hockey players standing nearby. And they thought, gee, those guys are kitted out for a hockey game. But none of them are near a hockey field, because we're not near a hockey field. And while they're walking in, on a predetermined signal, the book tells us, the hockey players jumped in, sticks and all, and had a fight with the church attenders. For 3 hours. Hockey sticks, punches flying, arms going at it, and they continued the service. Reverend Kennedy and his wife and little kid managed to make it into church while the brawl continued for 3 hours outside because of this issue. Wonderful story, isn't it? That is part of our history, it's part of our heritage, funny enough. F.J. Miles was a phenomenal, he's probably is one of those preachers that would fit into our church right now. Even though he was from the 1900s. He is a guy who served in Kalgoorlie for a bit. He did a lot of mission work in Sri Lanka and India for many years before he came here. And then after he served here for a couple of years, a couple of months really, wasn't he? He moved on and he got into the army as a chaplain, as a senior chaplain, and a very decorated soldier. He was awarded medals. His 2 sons died in World War II. The typewriter over here represents him because he lost all his medals in the Blitz in London. He lived in America till the late 50s. And he wrote to them and asked for, replacement for his medals, etc. But he was a guy who got headlines in the Cal Minor because he was the most reasonable parson that they had seen. Because in the heat of Kalgoorlie, he allowed the blokes to take off their jackets, take off their hats, loosen their ties and roll up their sleeves so they could be more comfortable. Gasp horror. And they went, found a reasonable parson. That was the Kalgoorlie Miners article. A guy who understood that. And one of the funny things about Kalgoorlie is that in our heritage as a Baptist church, Baptist denomination in Cal, it's very clear that we have been a church that's had a history of being very aware of the culture of our town. We've been very aware that we're a bit different, You're going to run things a bit differently out here in Kalgoorlie. One of the funniest stories that we have is when our church was sold in the early 1900s again, and they sold the building to the Methodists, who aren't here anymore. And they sold the building to the Methodists after a bit of bantering, and they decided, right, well, let's move this, ginormous building. So in they got, and they started, towing it down as they did back in those days. And they're a bit worried because it might not fit under the telegraph poles and electricity poles and all that. So they kind of tried their best, but sure enough, didn't work out that well, and it got stuck. So they left it in the middle of the street for a week. And they left our church standing in the middle of the street for a week because they couldn't move it. They just drove around it, carried around it, walked around it, and left it there, sitting there for a week. One of the other stories is an interesting one. Annie Oliver, who was the owner of the Cremorne Hotel in Perth, was somewhere in her journey had come to Christ. And it changed her so dramatically. She sold her hotel and split all the profits up back to the Baptist Union And they used that money to pay for the building of churches all around WA. Ours being one, which resulted in our church, way back when, opening debt-free. Way back when. It's an interesting journey. Irene is testimony to the story. The second time our church got open debt-free was when we built, when Kalgoorlie Baptist Church, as it's known, started. And on the day when they were going to start the building and get it, when everything was kind of happening, the final installments that they needed financially came through. And we opened debt-free. There's a story of our church in the 60s and 70s, bringing in buildings from all over places, dumping them on the ground, council saying, guys, this is not great. This building's an eyesore, and they had to get rid of it. And it says in the church minutes, after years of them trying to find a building and getting passes and all that stuff, it says back to square one, no building, no land. And then that building over there got given free of charge to the church. Our heritage is a group of people who took risks, boldly took risks. We are here because way back when someone went out and prayed over this place. Someone prayed for you and me one day. They didn't even know us. Said, God, for the church to come, we're going to do this. We're going to step in the gap. The sad thing about Cal is that a lot of people don't view Cal as home that often. We come here for a year or two and we end up 5 years later going, what happened? So when it comes to talking about finances and giving, it's always a bit of a tough thing. But somewhere, someone called Kalgoorlie home. And so much so that they invested in it. They said, I'm going to do this. This is what God's calling me to do. Now, I'm going to do it. And because of their sacrifice, we're here. Our history tells us that twice before, when it came to building a new church, taking this huge step out there and saying, we're going to be a voice for Jesus here, twice they went out not knowing what was going to happen, and when the day came for the doors to be opened, they were debt-free and it was all there. God provides for this church, as He does for all of us. And Nehemiah, just like he did with those people, he reminded them, as we stand here and rebuild this ground, let's remember that others have been here before us. So 2 questions for you today. 1, what is your heritage? What are some people in your life that have... How many of us here have come to faith because of maybe a family member or someone significant in your childhood or youth, or someone who stood by you and explained things to you or connected with you or introduced you to God somehow, be it as a family we go to church? How many people were like that? Okay? We're here and we're a voice of heritage because of our heritage. First question is, what is your heritage? The second question is, what heritage would you like to leave behind? What would you like to leave behind? As a pastor, it's a bit easier because professionally my name's down there. But my hope is that, many years from now, when people look back and they thumb through the pages of Kalgoorlie Baptist Church and they end up at 2012, what are they going to find about me? What are they going to find out about you? When they look through your life story, when your family, one day when your great-great-great-great-grandchildren are sitting there and going, I might actually look back into our history a bit, and they find your page, they find your section, what are they going to find out about you? Nehemiah stood there with his people and he said, as we look back, we found when our people were faithful to you, God, and we found when our people really stuffed it up massively. We just completely messed it up. And we want to thank you, God, because in the midst of us stuffing up and fumbling and, forgetting about you, you, God, are faithful to us. You, God, have been there through thick and thin. You, God, have always been faithful. And I know for me, and I know for you, that is the same. God has been faithful. But we have an opportunity to ask ourselves 2 questions. God, let me thank you and honor you for the heritage I have. Maybe you've got a cactus heritage. Maybe your heritage is one of those ones that you really don't want to talk about. Then the second question becomes even more important to you, doesn't it? What am I going to leave behind? What am I going to work on? Often, especially in our culture, when it comes to questions of heritage for our kids, for our friends, for those who are going to occupy these seats in times to come, we kind of let it happen by accident. We kind of just let it happen. But Nehemiah and Ezra and Haggai and Zechariah, all those guys, those prophets of that day, said, you know what? That's not going to be the case with us. We're here. We're rebuilding this wall. We're doing these things. We are going to make sure that people come back to the simple concept that if your heritage is not built on God, it's not going to go anywhere. I think the greatest thing that we can have is that when people look back at us, be it the Kalgoorlie Baptist Church to come in 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, be it your family, your great-grandkids, be it your mates, be it just people, that they would see that God is your foundation. 2 Peter